December 1944. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the United States Army was entering the most dangerous phase of the war since Normandy. German forces had launched a massive counteroffensive, and within days the Allied front would bend, fracture, and threaten to collapse. But the most volatile moment of the Battle of the Bulge did not occur on the battlefield. It occurred inside the Allied High Command. During a critical meeting, General Omar Bradley, normally controlled, restrained, and methodical, forcefully confronted Dwight D. Eisenhower over a decision that would remove 2 American armies from his authority. Bradley protested sharply and told Eisenhower, "By God, Ike, I cannot be responsible to the American people if you do this. I resign." The room fell silent. Eisenhower paused, then replied evenly, "Brad, I, not you, am responsible to the American people." It's to scream. Those 2 sentences, spoken in the middle of a command crisis, captured the collision between personal authority and supreme command. They revealed how close the Allied leadership came to fracture at the height of the German offensive, and why Eisenhower refused to yield. To understand why Bradley reached that point, and why Eisenhower stood firm, we need to step back to the weeks before the Battle of the Bulge, when Allied victory still seemed inevitable and the command structure appeared stable. By late 1944, much of the Allied High Command believed the war in Europe was approaching its final stage. Paris had been liberated, German forces were retreating across multiple fronts, and American armies were advancing faster than planners had expected earlier in the year. At the center of those operations stood General Omar Bradley. He did not command through spectacle or bravado. His authority came from discipline, preparation, and an ability to manage enormous formations without drawing attention to himself. Where other commanders emphasized speed or showmanship, Bradley concentrated on logistics, coordination, and keeping large forces moving as a single system. That approach had produced results. By December 1944, Bradley commanded the 12th Army Group, controlling the largest concentration of American combat forces ever assembled under one commander. His responsibilities stretched across hundreds of miles of front, and his position placed him directly beneath Eisenhower in the Allied chain of command. Eisenhower's role was fundamentally different. He was not directing individual battles or divisions. His responsibility was to preserve unity across a multinational coalition, American and British forces fighting under a single command in the middle of a continental war. Eisenhower understood that battlefield success meant little if authority collapsed under pressure. As winter set in, the Allied front extended deep into Western Europe. The Ardennes forest, dense, rugged, and long considered unsuitable for large-scale offensive operations, was lightly defended, held primarily by American units recovering from earlier fighting. This was a calculated risk, based on the belief that Germany lacked the fuel, manpower, and coordination to mount another major offensive. That belief was wrong. On the morning of December 16, 1944, German forces struck without warning along the Ardennes front. Under heavy fog and poor weather, armored and infantry units punched through thinly held American positions, achieving surprise at multiple points along the line. Within hours, the scale of the attack became clear. Entire American divisions were overrun or forced into chaotic withdrawals. Communications faltered, roads clogged with retreating units and refugees. Situational awareness deteriorated rapidly. Bradley's command absorbed the initial brunt of what would become the Battle of the Bulge. The 1st and Ninth Armies, both under his authority, came under intense pressure, particularly along the northern shoulder of the German penetration. As the front buckled, a critical problem emerged. The 1st Army, under General Courtney Hodges, was bearing the brunt of the attack along the northern shoulder of the Bulge. The Ninth Army, under General William Simpson, lay farther north, increasingly isolated by the shifting front and the collapse of reliable communications. In theory, both armies still answered to Bradley. In practice, that relationship was becoming increasingly fragile. German advances, poor weather, damaged infrastructure, and the sheer speed of the offensive disrupted communications across the Ardennes. Telephone lines were cut. Radio traffic was intermittent and unreliable. Reports arriving at higher headquarters were often outdated by the time they were received, while others contradicted each other entirely. Bradley was no longer receiving a coherent picture of the battlefield. Unit locations shifted faster than maps could be updated. Command decisions had to be made with partial information, often hours behind events on the ground. The deeper the German penetration grew, the harder it became for Bradley to exercise meaningful control over forces that were fighting for survival. On the northern flank, this problem carried strategic consequences. If the German attack succeeded in widening the Bulge to the north, Allied lines risked being split completely. The road network leading toward Antwerp, one of the most critical logistical ports for the Allied advance, lay within reach if the northern shoulder collapsed. This was not a local crisis. It was a threat to the entire Allied position in northwest Europe. Compounding the issue was geography. Bradley's headquarters was positioned to manage a broad American front, not a rapidly evolving crisis that now demanded immediate coordination across national boundaries. British forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery were deployed directly adjacent to the threatened sector, operating under a separate command structure but facing the same enemy pressure. As the situation deteriorated, coordination between American and British forces became urgent. Defensive lines needed to be aligned. Reserves had to be positioned with a unified purpose. Counterattacks required timing and cooperation that could not be achieved through fragmented command channels. What the northern flank required was not simply bravery or determination. It required a single, coherent authority capable of issuing rapid orders based on the clearest available information. Bradley understood the danger on the ground, but he was constrained by the limits of communication and distance. The battlefield was moving faster than his headquarters could respond. Orders that might have stabilized the situation risked arriving too late or being overtaken by events entirely. For Eisenhower, this was the decisive factor. Supreme command was not about assigning blame or protecting reputations. It was about ensuring that the front held together under extreme pressure. The northern flank could not afford divided authority, delayed coordination, or ambiguity over who was in charge. The issue was no longer whether Bradley was capable, respected, or experienced. The issue was whether the existing command arrangement could function under the conditions imposed by the German offensive. By the time Eisenhower evaluated the situation, the answer was becoming clear. The northern shoulder of the Bulge required immediate consolidation under a single commander with intact communications, direct proximity to the crisis, and the authority to coordinate Allied forces without delay. From Eisenhower's perspective, the situation on the northern flank had reached a point where delay was no longer an option. The German offensive had not only broken through American lines, it had disrupted the structure that allowed those lines to function as a coordinated whole. Supreme command existed for moments exactly like this. Eisenhower's responsibility was not to preserve existing arrangements, but to ensure that the front did not collapse while those arrangements were debated. The central issue was unity of command. On the northern shoulder of the Bulge, American forces were fighting alongside British formations under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Yet authority remained divided. Bradley nominally controlled the First and Ninth Armies, but his ability to direct them was increasingly constrained by distance, disrupted communications, and the speed of the German advance. Orders could not move faster than events on the ground. Montgomery, by contrast, was positioned closer to the crisis. His headquarters retained intact communications. He already exercised operational control over British forces defending the same sector. From Eisenhower's standpoint, consolidating authority under a single commander on the northern flank offered the fastest way to restore coherence. This was not a judgment about national competence. It was a calculation about proximity, infrastructure, and speed. Eisenhower understood the political sensitivity of the move. American armies placed under British command carried symbolic weight, especially in the midst of a crisis. But symbolism could not outweigh operational necessity. Coalition warfare required flexibility, particularly when national pride conflicted with battlefield reality. In moments of crisis, command structures must bend, or they break. Eisenhower had faced this reality before. As Supreme Commander, his role was to make decisions that others could not, or would not, make. He knew that any delay, any attempt to soften the decision, would only increase confusion and weaken authority at the moment it was most needed. The question Eisenhower asked himself was not whether the decision would anger Bradley. It was whether the northern flank could survive another 48 hours without unified command. In his judgment, it could not. The order to place the First and Ninth Armies under Montgomery's temporary control was therefore not an act of preference, nor a slight against an American commander. It was an act of risk management, made under pressure, with incomplete information, and with the understanding that the cost of inaction would be far higher than the cost of controversy. That decision would stabilize the northern flank. But it would also provoke one of the most intense confrontations Eisenhower would face during the war. Once the decision was implemented, its effects became visible almost immediately. On the northern flank, the consolidation of command brought clarity to a situation that had been dangerously fluid. Defensive lines were aligned, reserves were positioned with a common purpose, and coordination between American and British forces improved under a single operational authority. Montgomery's role was not to launch dramatic counteroffensives. His task was more basic and more urgent. He was to hold the northern shoulder of the Bulge, prevent further German expansion, and buy time. That time would prove decisive. The German offensive had been built on speed and surprise. Once its momentum slowed, the underlying weaknesses of Hitler's plan began to surface. Fuel shortages worsened. Supply lines stretched thin. German units that failed to break through quickly became exposed and vulnerable. By stabilizing the northern flank, Eisenhower's decision removed the most dangerous variable in the battle. It prevented the Bulge from widening and ensured that the German advance could not reach its strategic objectives, including the vital port facilities tied to Antwerp. This stabilization created the conditions Eisenhower needed to execute the second half of his response, an aggressive counterstroke from the south. While the northern flank held, General George S. Patton's Third Army was already moving. Anticipating the possibility of a German offensive, Patton had prepared contingency plans that allowed him to pivot his forces with remarkable speed. Within 48 hours, he redirected his army northward, executing one of the most complex operational maneuvers of the war. Patton's counterattack toward Bastogne would become legendary, but it did not occur in isolation. It was enabled by the fact that the northern shoulder of the Bulge had been secured. Without that stability, Patton's maneuver would have risked exposing his own flanks to a widening German advance. The relief of Bastogne marked the psychological turning point of the battle. German forces, already struggling with logistics and weather, now faced coordinated pressure from multiple directions. The initiative began to shift. As Allied counterattacks gained momentum, the German offensive stalled and then began to collapse. What had started as Hitler's last gamble ended as a costly failure, draining German reserves that could not be replaced. In retrospect, the Battle of the Bulge was not won by a single dramatic action or by any one commander. It was won through a sequence of decisions that restored coherence under extreme pressure. Eisenhower's willingness to centralize command on the northern flank was one of those decisions. The confrontation with Bradley had been painful. The controversy surrounding Montgomery had been unavoidable. But the result was unmistakable. The front held. The German advance was contained, and the Allied armies emerged from the crisis with their structure and momentum intact. By January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated. The German army had lost its last strategic reserve in the west. The path to the Rhine lay open. The question of command had been settled not by argument, but by outcome. In the months that followed the Battle of the Bulge, attention shifted from crisis to consolidation. The German offensive had failed. Allied momentum was restored, and as the war moved toward its final phase, questions of command, recognition, and promotion inevitably resurfaced. In March 1945, Omar Bradley was promoted to the rank of 4-star general, a promotion made permanent several years later. Almost immediately, speculation followed. Some observers suggested that the promotion was meant to compensate Bradley for the way he had been sidelined during the Battle of the Bulge, particularly after the public visibility given to Montgomery on the northern flank. The interpretation was understandable, but incomplete. At the same time, Eisenhower and Secretary of War Henry Stimson had both sought to reward George Patton for his exceptional performance during 1944, especially his rapid maneuver during the Bulge. Yet Patton could not be promoted ahead of Bradley or other senior commanders without disrupting the chain of command. Patton operated under Bradley's authority. Elevating him prematurely would have created a structural contradiction within the Allied hierarchy. The more straightforward explanation lay in command logic, not compensation. Bradley commanded an army group. Eisenhower, as supreme commander, had been promoted to 5-star rank in December 1944. In such a structure, it was both customary and necessary that Bradley hold the next lower rank. The promotion reflected responsibility, not restitution. Understanding this distinction matters, because it reframes the confrontation during the Battle of the Bulge. Bradley was not punished, he was not marginalized, and Eisenhower did not attempt to undo a personal slight with symbolic gestures afterward. The chain of command remained intact, governed by role and responsibility rather than emotion. The episode instead reveals something deeper about leadership under pressure. Bradley's reaction was human. He felt stripped of authority at the moment when the battle mattered most. His anger reflected pride, responsibility, and fear of public judgment. None of those impulses were unreasonable. Eisenhower's response, however, reflected a different burden. As Supreme Commander, he was required to absorb resentment in order to preserve coherence. He could not afford to protect egos, reputations, or national sensitivities when the front itself was at risk. The two sentences exchanged during that confrontation captured the essence of command in coalition warfare. Bradley spoke from the position of responsibility he felt toward his troops and his country. Eisenhower spoke from the authority he was obligated to exercise on behalf of the entire alliance. Neither man was wrong about what he represented, but only one of them could decide. The Battle of the Bulge ultimately ended not with a dramatic collapse or a heroic charge, but with the restoration of order, authority held, command structures adapted, and the Allied armies emerged stronger for having survived the test. In that sense, the confrontation between Bradley and Eisenhower was not a failure of leadership. It was evidence of leadership under strain, messy, uncomfortable, and necessary. History often remembers battles through maps and movements, but sometimes the outcome turns on a few sentences spoken in a room far from the front lines. Subscribe for more in-depth history like this, stories about decisions, pressure, and leadership behind the battles. If you have thoughts on Eisenhower, Bradley, or the Battle of the Bulge, leave a comment below. And if this video added value, share it with someone who cares about history beyond the surface.